Hi class, this video is going to be about taking a closer look at a model for a problem solution writing experience. And remember, this is just a model. This isn't exactly how yours needs to look. Your audience may be very different than the New York Times audience. Maybe yours is for a particular person, and so you need to write a letter, or you need to write a report, or some other form that I haven't mentioned yet. So this is just a model, kind of a good practices for what you might need to include in this problem solution writing experience. Okay, so this is College Isn't for Everyone by Oren Cass. And I know a lot of times you're taught, let's put the thesis first thing right up front. Well, he doesn't really do that until a lot later. We have a good idea of what this is going to be about, and the title basically tells it for us. College isn't for everyone, so we have a good idea of what this article is going to be about already. So titles are important. First, he starts off with a hook. Instead of starting with a thesis, Cass gives us two scenarios that introduce us to the problem, basically two stories of these two high school seniors, and it draws us in and it actually shows us what the problem is rather than tells us. Another thing, and I want to show you that yes, authors who are in the New York Times can have room for improvement. So I feel like this article has room for improvement right here in this highlighted text where he says, federal funding for higher education has grown by 133% in the past 30 years. Well, where did he get that number? Don't you think it would be more convincing if he cited where he got that information? Because how do I know he's not just making it up? I'm sure he's not just making it up, but it would be better if I knew where that number came from. And newspapers do have, they don't usually have citations afterwards, but he could have put in a little thing where he said, according to the budget or whatever for the government this year, this is where I got this number, but he doesn't say that. All right, moving on. He starts to actually talk about what the problem is and one of the causes for this problem. And that's another good thing to go about, is not just explain the problem, but to actually figure out why is this problem happening in the first place. And then he also gives lots of evidence for why he believes his explanation of encouraging everyone to go to college is misguided. And basically, sentence after sentence, just lots of evidence. And evidence will help you to convince your audience that what you say is important and true, and it strengthens your argument. He also uses a transition trick to help his audience stay with him by using words like, he doesn't use first, he uses one explanation, and then he goes a second explanation. Another fun word trick he does is he uses repetition purposefully to make his point clear. He says, if that were true, and explains why this isn't true. Down here, Cass actually does inform us of where he got his information. He says the Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics. So that makes me feel better about where this information came from. Then later on, he finally starts to lay out the solution to his problem. Now, one thing about his solution is that would be a room for improvement is that he has no outside evidence of others who agree with his solution or studies that would help prove its efficacy. And outside sources might help here, but maybe he doesn't have outside sources because this is an original idea, and there's nothing wrong with not having outside sources. It could be more helpful depending on the audience, but just having this idea out there for a newspaper, this might be okay to not have like study after study showing, well, this is why this would work. This is just an idea, and he's just putting out there into the world because everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people read the New York Times about this is something that we could do. And it's not till the very end that we really get to his main point that I've highlighted in green. A false promise of college success does more harm than good. So before we had the title where he's saying college isn't for everyone, but he kind of tells us why now at the end. And a lot of times you can have if you want to cite them, a lot of times you can find it, and I'll show you in a research video where to find it already in the MLA format that you need. Okay, moving on. I want to talk a little bit about introducing quotes and how you're supposed to include sources in your writing. So a lot of the ways to do this is just to do quotes. You can say X just stands for the author states, and you can just quote. And then usually you would have what page number it came from in parentheses after that. There's a lot of, this is a document that you have in your folder for Unit 3. So you can just look at several of these, and just these are just different templates that you can use to explain and introduce your sources. Another thing that you do is a lot of times when you introduce a quote, you can't just say it and then move on. You have to kind of explain that quote. So you can kind of restate it in your own words, saying, in other words, X believes blank, or X's point is that blank. So you're kind of translating for your audience what this quote really means. So again, this is something that you can refer back to easily. I want to show you another model of a way to introduce sources in an actual essay. This is more of a formal researched argument. So it looks a little bit different than the writing experience that I'm asking you to do, but it's still a really good model too, so it's not a bad one to look at, and I'll include it here as well. So one way to introduce a source is to put all of the information up there. So she puts in the article, Do Social Networks Make Us Sick? Author Vito Pellecci recounts the story of Marissa Murray. So it explains who the author is, what the article is. They didn't tell us where it came from, but that information will all be in the works cited later. So one way to quote information is to start with a sentence. They were all looking at their phones, colon. You have a complete sentence before that, and then you have the quote, and then she really didn't need the period right there, but then she has the author and then the page number, and then the period should have gone after the parentheses. So sometimes you want to paraphrase a source. So she started with, according to Pellecci, there have been many studies, and explained it. And then she explained the source. For example, Larry Rosen, professor of psychology at California State University, gave a speech to the American Psychological Association outlining the results of the study. Because in that article, it wasn't Pellecci speaking, it was Larry Rosen. They're probably quoting Larry Rosen in that article, and she needed to explain where all of it came from. So I really appreciate knowing all of that information about where this information comes from. So that's another, down here's another instance of her using in the article, Facebook can make users feel worse. Author Jeffrey Mohan of the Baltimore Sun, she includes the publication in there, discusses a study led by the University of Michigan. So she puts all of that information in there again. And again, there's another example of paraphrasing. She puts the author, Mohan, and then she paraphrases, not quotes. She's putting information in her own words, but it's still she's still giving credit where it's due, and she's saying she got this information from page 3 of the article Mohan wrote. So this one, she introduced an article earlier on by Steers, and then she just simply says Steers says, and then quotes, and then puts the page number, period. So those are just some ways of seeing how to introduce quotes and paraphrases in a real life scenario. Here I want to show you a different way to include your sources. So this writer chose not to do all of that information up front about where all of her sources come from and why they're reliable. She wanted a cleaner, wording where it could be kind of clunky when you say, so-and-so said this from this, and this is why they said it. And she prefers to paraphrase a lot and just tell you the source at the end. So like this whole paragraph is paraphrased, and then we have where she got that information, McDonnell and Malone. at the end, and there must not have been a page number or she would have included it. So that's another way you can do it. Again, here's another example of something that she paraphrased with the author's name and the page number at the end. Again, lots of paraphrasing, author, page number at the end. I'm going to come back to these things I've highlighted in blue in just a second. So in one instance, she did include at least the publication. She said, as explained in the Lancet, instead of saying Radcliffe or Richards said. We don't know who Radcliffe or Richards is, but maybe we know the Lancet is a medical journal, or maybe her audience knows that that's a medical journal, a well-respected medical journal, and that's why she included the publication up front instead of the author's name. And then she quotes and puts the author's name, and she put the year here. Because maybe she has, or I guess that might be the page number. If she's doing MLA, it's most likely the page number. Different citation methods require different things. So now I want to talk about these things I've highlighted in blue, which is counter-argument, which is something that you might consider using. It's a good practice to use when you are writing about your problem and your solution. And counter-argument, all that means is just telling us a little bit of what the other side might be thinking. Whatever argument you're putting out, there's always somebody who's going, yeah, but... And so this is just her kind of acknowledging that there is another side, but always kind of bringing it back to her argument. So for the first example, and she does this a lot in these topic sentences, where she kind of focuses her paragraphs. So the first one is, while there may seem to be a shortage of kidneys, she says, like this is what a lot of people think, but she kind of brings it back to her argument. In reality, there's a surplus. Moving on to the next one, she says, there is certainly a risk in donating a kidney. So she has that acknowledgement that it is a risk, but she uses the word, but this risk is not great enough to be outlawed. That's a great way. Just using that word but is a great way to bring it back to your argument. But it's always nice to know that you have thought about the other side and what the other side's arguments might be. Again, she has another counter-argument. Some agree with Pope John Paul II that the selling of organs is morally wrong and violates the dignity of the human person. So that was something that she had quoted in one of her sources. And then she uses that word, but again, this is a belief professed by healthy and affluent individuals. So she kind of shows, well, why this argument may not hold up in all places. So the idea of a counter-argument is just something you might want to include or not, depending on your audience. Now again, these models are just models. That's not how you have to do things. For the MLA citation, I suggest that you do it that way because that's the best way for us to understand in this class to know that you got your sources from certain places. But as far as like how to go about writing it, it's kind of up to you. But these are some good practices to follow.